Welcome to the Protagonist Pub. My name is Tammy, and we're gonna vlog the Odyssey by Homer. As you know, I am buddy reading the Odyssey with Lindsay over June and July. So this is going to be a several month vlog in the process. I am also in June, coincidentally, reading the How to Read a Book, the Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Dorn. And this is Anne's summer school book for 2026. And it is really, this is a June read, by the way, strictly in June, a great companion to how to intelligently read Homer. And I thought I would just pair them up together in this vlog because they go so well together. I did read both the Iliad and the Odyssey in high school, way back when Dirt was young. I remember enjoying them then. I had an amazing English teacher in high school. Her name was Sister Rosemary. And she made sure we understood the material as we were reading it. And there was no, it's too hard, let's read something else nonsense. If I recall correctly, we read one in freshman year and one in sophomore year. Our class size obviously was very small, and it was an amazing reading experience. And I know that reading it with Lindsay is going to be an equally amazing reading experience. And we are reading the Robert Fagles translation, which is considered one of the best. And he doesn't interject his personal politics into his translation, which I think is criminal and should immediately disqualify any translation of such nonsense from being upheld as being faithful. And not just in particular, ancient Greek or ancient Roman stuff, but had that same experience earlier this year with a translation of The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, in which the text I was reading was one translation and the audio I was listening to was a Victorian translation of the Russian, and the Victorian translation cleaned up Dostoevsky's language because she was translated by a female. Are we noticing a pattern? Didn't like his word choices. It lended a completely different meaning than the translation I was actually physically reading. Needless to say, I didn't finish The Brothers Karamazov, but I will go back to it because I was enjoying what I was reading. And I will physically read it. So, I thought I would start this vlog. I'm going to read the introduction before the actual book begins, and the introduction is 60 odd pages. And I am very much looking forward to this with Lindsay. I know we're going to have great discussions. I know it isn't going to be filled with nonsense and political correctness and, cleaning up of hurtful words. Words aren't hurtful. Words are just words. It's your reaction to words that, quote unquote, make them hurtful. So I'll let you know how we get on. There is something to be said when the opening paragraph of the introduction is brilliance itself. I will read it to you. Odyssey is a familiar English word meaning, according to Webster, a series of adventurous journeys usually marked by the many changes of fortune. The Greek word Odysseus, the form of which from which the English word is derived, means simply the story of Odysseus, a Greek hero of the Trojan War who took 10 years to find his way back from Troy to his home on the island of Ithaca, off the western coast of mainland Greece. Homer's Odyssey does indeed present us with adventurous journeys and changes of fortune, but it is also an epic tale of the hero's return to find at home a situation more dangerous than anything he faced on the plains of Troy or in his wanderings over uncharted seas. In one paragraph, the word is defined and the plot is detailed without any spoilers. It's brilliance. The second paragraph begins with the summary from Aristotle and Poetics. A certain man has been abroad many years. He is alone, and the god Poseidon keeps a hostile eye on him. At home, the situation is that suitors for his wife's hand are draining his resources and plotting to kill his son. Then, after suffering storm and shipwreck, he comes home, makes himself known, attacks the suitors. He survives, and they are destroyed. End quote. I love quote unquote book reviews from the past that are just like, here's the facts. What else do you want? It's so very me. I just learned something. The first printed edition of Homer, issued in Florence in 1488, was composed in a type that imitated contemporary Greek handwriting, with all its complicated ligatures and abbreviations. Early printers tried to make their books look like handwritten manuscripts because in scholarly circles, printed books were regarded as vulgar and inferior products. Cheap paperbacks, so to speak. That is the first I've ever heard of that. I love that. Oh my stars. For the best part of 1,000 years since the end of the Roman Empire, the knowledge of Greek had been almost lost in Western Europe. In the 14th century, it was reintroduced into Italy from Byzantium, where Greek-speaking Christian empire had maintained itself ever since Constantine made the city the capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. I never knew how close we came to losing Greek as a language. Even more closely to become to losing it. The knowledge of Greek and the manuscripts of the Greek classics, Homer included, came to Italy just in time. In May 1453, Byzantium fell to the Ottoman Turks, and the Greek Empire of the East came to the end of its 1,000-year career. During its long life, it had carefully preserved, copied, and recopied a select number of the Greek masterpieces of pre-Christian times, Homer prominent among them. In the ancient world, the Iliad consisted of a number of papyrus rolls, the text written in columns on the inside surface. The rolls could not be too big, or they would break when opened for reading. A long poem, like that of the Odyssey, might require as many as 24. In fact, it is possible that the so-called books of our text represent an original division into papyrus rolls. Okay, I'm on the third page of this introduction, and I am learning so much already. Okay, so it has been about a week or a little more since I last filmed a clip. It's been very busy, and I apologize for the no makeup, but jump scares happen. I am about halfway through the introduction to the Odyssey. It is fascinating. It requires my complete attention. Cannot read it when there's other noise in the house. I certainly can't read it when Dave's working from home and is taking meetings and stuff. It's truly so absorbing a read that I have pages of notes on just those first 30 odd pages of the introduction. And it is fascinating. I have learned stuff I either knew and have forgotten, or never knew and just learned. Couldn't tell you which one is true. I'm just going to give you, see all those little annotation tags? That is just the first 30 pages of the intro. And some of them are just all tightly grouped together, so it doesn't look like that many, but trust me, there's a lot, and that doesn't take into account all the post-it notes I have scattered in the text as well, which I have since transferred to notebook paper because reasons. So I have learned fascinating things. Like, the Greeks didn't get papyrus from the Egyptians, they got it from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians called themselves Canaanites. They originated in the Levant. I probably knew that fact from, going to Catholic school my entire life, with an exception here or there. But I have certainly forgotten it in the interim years. There is a very detailed discussion in those first 30 odd pages of the introduction, which is 67 pages long, talking about all the different theories of the origin of the play and Homer as the author, dating from the dark ages of the ancient world through modern day, the Romantic Rebellion, trying to claim that the poem itself is a combination of oral and written tradition, and it didn't exist in the format we have in the ancient past, to the theory that, no, that's just wrong, and how differing schools of thought have had their own interpretation of Homer. And in 1928, a man called, I want to say Adam Perry, was able to, quote unquote, prove that the, now I'm going to need to know if it was Adam Perry. Anyway, linguistically, the poem was meant to be spoken, and thus okay, now I have to find the quote. Hang on. Here we go. Naming conventions in the poems, talking about both the Iliad and the Odyssey, allowed Perry to prove that they were for use of and by oral poets, which allowed them to improvise and maintain the epic meter. And if you know anything about both the Iliad and the Odyssey, the epic meter is everything. It forms the basis for which the poem is to be read. And it was entirely fascinating. His name was Milman Perry, not Adam Perry. And he was a professor at Harvard, and he did most of his significant work in Paris. And his theory was released in 1928 in Paris, and it didn't make its way to America until 1971. And ultimately, the conclusion in the introduction to this translation is that Perry made a lot of breakthroughs in the poem, but he stretched his theory too far, and he forced compliance where it didn't naturally exist. But he's come the closest, at least at the time this version was published, which was 1996. And the entire discussion of the background of Homer has just been fascinating, and the origins of the poem. And I am now at the part where it's talking about the actual poem itself. It's giving a broad overview for the reader, talking about how from almost the beginning, people have been trying to plot the course of Odysseus, and it makes no sense, and there's no way to accurately do it, in part because Homer, much like myself, was obviously easily lost because he has a very rudimentary, scant knowledge of his local geography, let alone the geography of wider Greece. So it's next to impossible to plot the course of the book. And overall, it is just, the introduction is doing so much heavy lifting to familiarize the modern reader, to explain themes that are ever present throughout the poem, that if you skip reading the intro, you would very likely, as a modern reader, multiple tens of centuries removed from the origins of the poem, likely to miss. Like the welcoming the coming of the stranger and speeding the parting of the stranger. And that comes from Pope's translation, who's considered, and his translation is considered one of the best. And it's just overall, I'm fascinated. I won't bore you overly long, but I have roughly 30 pages left. Not roughly, I have 30 pages left. And there's subheadings on each of the sections of the introduction. The next subheading I'm going to read is the hero. So obviously Odysseus. Then comes the gods, which is going to be a nice refresher course on, the Greek gods. And then the next one is women and men. And, I'm fascinated. I'm reading it slowly. I'm not trying to rush through to meet deadlines on this one. I'm taking my time, which leads me into the second book I'm going to talk about in this vlog. And that is How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. That's what the cover looks like. And as many of you certainly know by the time this video comes out, this was Anne's over at In Search of Wonder, and I will link her down below. 2026 summer school book that she chose for herself, and she invited the rest of us to read, and it is fascinating. It was first published in 1940, and the preface to this book was published in 1972 with the book, and the authors talk about how they have pretty extensively revised the book in the intervening 30 odd years since the first publication, and the preface to the book is if they were alive today and were writing a new preference for 2026, they would fall out of their chairs. He talks extensively about how the decade of the 1970s was declared to make readers of Americans, and how literacy was beginning to fall off because of the invention and prevalence of first the wireless radio and then television, and how that has fundamentally by 1972 had fundamentally changed the way people were learning, reading, getting information, etc. And how literacy rates were beginning to become an ever increasing concern, and how to make readers not just better, but so that their comprehension increases. So you can imagine Adler's absolute inability to comprehend that more than 50 years later, we are more illiterate than we were in 1972 when he was so concerned. We now have graduated functionally illiterate children who never should have passed high school, never should have passed grammar school, to be honest, and we're not raising a stink about it. I fear for the future. I fear for the lack of reading comprehension and the lack of basic reading skills. Just forget comprehension. The ability to read a sentence handed to someone has disappeared. There are a multitude of causes. You don't need me to go into them. I'm sure you're more than capable of understanding the problem, but it is terrifying. I will say there are benefits to being an older reader at this point in my life, when I know that there are more years behind me than in front of me, because we are quickly approaching a tipping point and stumbling backwards as the world moves forwards. Let me move. So, I've read the first part. It is also heavily tabbed, annotated, and the first part is talking about the different types of readers and being an active reader. So the authors of the book have identified 4 levels of reading. The first level is the elementary level, how we learn to actually read. Not necessarily comprehension, but the ability to recognize symbols on a page as distinct words. Comprehension comes later in elementary, but first you have to understand the symbols. Then there's inspectional reading, which is really the art of skimming a book. And it is also something that we are losing as table of contents in newly published work, fiction and nonfiction included, unfortunately, become more rare. And footnotes are contained at the bottom of the page, rather gathered in the back, where they're far more easily accessible, and you can see the relationship between footnotes when they're together versus at the bottom. Yes, I have a definite preference. And indexes are becoming more uncommon than common, unfortunately. And all of those things together, with the addition of reading like the preface of a book or the introduction, preface and introduction in these two, and getting a large, bird's eye view of what the book is. Skimming the content. Are you interested? Do you already know it? Are there new concepts you need to be aware of? That's introspectional reading. The third level of reading is I, of course, have just had it fly right out of my head. Hang on. There we go. Let me find it. I don't know how I could forget this. The third level of reading is analytical reading, which is reading for the point of understanding what you're reading, aka reading comprehension. It requires active participation in the text. Now, this is much more focused on a nonfiction book in particular for analytical reading when you need to understand concepts you are not necessarily familiar with. A chemistry book or, history of a country you are not intimately familiar with. It applies, don't get me wrong, completely applies to fictional reading as well. He gives a great example of this when teachers teach high school. They teach, let's take Shakespeare. He gives examples of Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and As You Like It, as plays commonly taught in high school. And teachers teach the plays by picking it apart from the get-go, rather than having the students read the play first without, picking apart concepts and phraseology and all of the things, and whether or not they understand it, just read the play and then go back and read the play by picking apart concepts and phrases and terminology, history, you don't understand, and filling in the gaps. That is analytical reading in conjunction with the second step. First step is really just skimming it when you read the play without the context. And the second step, or the next step would be understanding what you're reading. And I am lucky. By the time I got to high school, I am positive Sister Rosemary had read this book just by the way she taught us literature. Because when we read something unfamiliar or quote unquote difficult, we didn't just read it in short blurbs. I know for a fact when we read a Shakespeare play, and we read many throughout 4 years, we would read the play first, and then we would start to discuss it and pick it apart, talk about things, we didn't get. So I know she's read this book, or may God have mercy on her soul. So I am very thankful that I was blessed by that. And the final category of the 4 levels of reading they identify in this book is synodal reading. Is that what they call it? It's the most difficult type of reading, and it is synoptical, not synodal. Sorry, synodal is something else. Synoptical reading. And it is the level that the most advanced readers get to. It is the level of complexity and understanding how multiple books in a subject matter relate to one another. For example, 1776 by David McCullough. How does it relate to the John Adams biography he wrote of David McCullough? And how does My Dear Friend by Lynn Watney, which is a biography of Abigail Adams, relate to the previous two? That is synoptical reading. It is trying to understand the individual texts and then weave together the various viewpoints and facts and get the big overview picture in detail. It is fascinating. I am enjoying it. But again, it is one I need to read when the house is quiet and there's not a lot of interruptions. So, it may be a little slow, but I am good with that. Okay. That is where I'm at. Okay, I am back with another update. I have made progress in both books. So first up, let's talk about how to read a book. I am currently on chapter 10, and it is amazing. You've already heard me rave about it. The annotation fest continues. I have pages of notes, literally pages of notes. And what I will say is that in large part, this is mostly applicable to nonfiction, and the authors tell you that up front. And I'm sure it can be adapted for fiction, particularly older fiction, classics, and really dense fiction. But I am currently reading a lot of nonfiction. There's a lot of nonfiction that I'm just like barreling through. Apparently I'm in the mood for it. And so I'm finding this just exquisitely helpful. And what I'm also just absolutely in love with this book for is that in it, I can see the echoes of Sister Rosemary. Now, Sister Rosemary was my English literature teacher in high school. We all loved her. We were all terrified of her in the best possible way, but she made us better human beings, and she made us better readers, and it is such a joy to see echoes of her in a book I picked up because it came recommended from another booktuber that I wasn't expecting to find her in. And every time I catch a, an echo of her in a chapter, I'm just like thanking the Lord with how blessed I was with the quality of education I received. And she would be so pleased as punch to see me now. Not just because I'm reading. She always knew I was a reader. That was never an issue. But the variety I'm reading and the careful manner in which I read stuff. And, I see her and I am so thankful for her. And yeah, so I'm on chapter 10, like I said, which is how to criticize a book fairly, which we all know I can tend to DNF a book quickly. But so I'm very interested to see how this chapter is going to impact me. But again, it's mostly nonfiction based. So at this point, I highly recommend this book. Yes, it is dense. Yes, it requires, at least for me, the house to be relatively silent when I am reading it. But not because the material is difficult, but because I'm laser focused on what I'm reading. So more on that to come. Okay. Update on the Odyssey. I have finally finished the prologue. All 67 pages of it? And yeah, the annotations continued. I learned so much in this prologue. It was amazing. Did I remember stuff that we, discussed in Sister Rosemary's literature class? I absolutely did. Did I learn things I didn't learn before? Pretty sure I did, or if I did learn them in high school, they went in one ear and out the other. Things like the Phoenicians referred to themselves as Canaanites, or that there are 24 books in the Odyssey because when it got transferred to papyrus, it probably took 24 scrolls of papyrus to write down the text. I've learned about all the theories of Homer. Was it written by one man? Was it written by many men? Did he actually write it? It is, the introduction to this has been fascinating, and I have learned so much. I have pages just filled with notes for myself, and I am glad I took as much time as I did with the introduction and I didn't skip it, because it was just an incredibly important read for me personally. I will say Prime Day is coming up, and there are, as always, early deals, and one of those early deals was a bind up of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Aeneid into one volume, translated by Robert Fagles. Did I buy it? Yes, I did. Is it arriving today? Yes, it is. Do I feel remotely bad about that? I do not. So, of those 3 books, the Odyssey is actually the middle chronologically. The Odyssey is the conclusion of the Iliad. And the Aeneid is written by Virgil, who was a Roman, so after the Greeks chronologically. I'm so looking forward to that book being on my shelves. It was like 60 odd % off. I didn't feel bad about it. Yeah. Translations matter. Trying to insert modern day ethics into ancient poetry is, I'll be kind and say foolhardy. I have other words, but I'll say foolhardy. So, I have read the first 2 books. The first book is Athena, opens up with Athena on Mount Olympus talking to Zeus about the state of the mortal world and Odysseus being lost, and she wants to go inspire Telemachus to kick the suitors out of his palace and find out what happened to his dad. Zeus agrees. She goes down to the mortal realm in disguise, of course. Inspires Telemachus. The Penelope weaving a death shroud for her father-in-law comes out in the first book, and the results thereof. All of the suitors for Penelope are infuriated when Telemachus says, "Stop eating my wine and eating my food, or drinking my wine and eating my food, and go back to your own houses." And they're just absolutely incensed that he had the unmitigated gall to attempt to kick them out. And it's, there's this theory that is discussed in the intro about how Telemachus is just this misogynist because he, is dismissive of his mother. Well, that scene occurs in the first book, and it isn't so much that he's a misogynist. In fact, it's quite clear that he's not. It's that he is a young man raised by his mother, and his father has been off to war for all of these years, and so he wasn't, he was raised without a father figure at home. His, grandfather is off in the wilderness mourning his son, and so of course he questions himself whether or not he can live up to his father's reputation and great heroic deeds, and he's trying to assert control over his inheritance. And it isn't so much that it isn't that he's a misogynist towards his mother. He is a young man rebelling against the only parental figure he's ever, grown up with. The woman who disciplined him, and the woman who told him no, and the woman who set boundaries. All teenagers, young adults rebel. It's nothing more than that. And trying to read into it 21st century norms is just utter nonsense. Just spare me. In book 2 is Telemachus getting, ready to set sail and go find his dad, and there is this baked in bias that Homer and Virgil and Chaucer are not just difficult to read, but unapproachable and unrelatable. And that is really not the case. A good translation makes all the difference. A translation that doesn't attempt to change the meaning of the original to fit modern sensibilities and keeps the epic meter going, especially in Homer, is vital. And this translation does that. And it is very readable. You have no trouble following what is going on because, in essence, it's an adventure story. Dad goes off to war in the Iliad and hasn't returned, and his now growing son is wondering what happened to his father. And is he inheriting the kingdom? Is dad still alive? Should mom remarry? All of those questions is the concern of the Odyssey. It isn't difficult to follow the story at all. And it reads quickly. It isn't something you're going to struggle with. It isn't something that is unapproachable. So, it is, in fact, a very easy read, and I am having trouble trying to stay somewhat even with Lindsay, who is my buddy reading partner with this. And I'm absolutely loving it. I fly through chapters. Just they're so interesting and so well done. And you can understand why this would be told around a campfire and why this has withstood the test of time. Just two books in. You understand why this has been told for thousands of years. So, there is my Odyssey update. And I'm sure I will be back with more. I thought I would film a brief update to the Odyssey. I am now on book 5. Am I on book 5? Good question. I am on book 5. I am so in love with this book again. So books 1 through 4 are basically setting up everything that's going on, and this, is Odysseus dead? Can Telemachus find his father? What are the gods up to? What are other kings up to? That's all. So it's all backstory in books 1 through 4. And in book 5, we finally meet Odysseus himself. And he is held captive on an island by Calypso. And as book 5 opens, the gods are on Mount Olympus discussing what should happen. And Athena is like, he deserves to go home to his family. So that's where I am. And the one reoccurring theme that is occurring in every book is the absolute beauty in which each day starts in the poem. And I have loved this imagery every time it shows up. Trying to find the one I really like. It's just back here. Hang on, let me find it. This is in book 4, and this is just indicative of, all of the appearances of Dawn so far. When young Dawn, with her rose-red fingers shone once more, the lord of the war cry climbed from bed and dressed. Over his shoulder he slung his well-honed sword, fastened rawhide sandals under his smooth feet, stepped from his bedroom, handsome as a god, and sat down by Telemachus. It just introduces each day beautifully and very similarly, but so far, no repetition. I'm loving that. Okay. By the time you see this, the overall video will be out, but I am replacing this copy so I can donate it back to the library, because what I thought was an omnibus is actually a box set. And I do not know why Penguin did this, but the Iliad does not match the directional packaging of the Odyssey and the Aeneid. So, but I now own all 3 great epic poems, and the other 2 are probably coming up for reading, if not this year, then next. And all 3 are the same translations team, Robert Fagles being the main translator. I am very excited about these. So, okay, like I said, brief update. There you go. Well, it's finally time to wrap up the vlog. I have finished Homer. I have finished How to Read a Book. So let's talk about this one first. I will admit I skimmed the final couple of chapters. Not the final couple of chapters. A couple of chapters. One of them was on how to read a mathematical work, and one was how to read a philosophical. I read more of the philosophical section than I did the mathematical section, because let's be honest, the chances of me reading a mathematical work is non-existent. Not gonna lie. So overall, would I recommend this book? I absolutely would. Is it highly applicable to reading literature or fiction? It is not. Is it much more applicable to nonfiction? It is. But that being said, it can be generally applicable to nonfiction or to fiction, especially classical fiction, in a very broad sense. And if you want to get more out of the nonfiction you read and to comprehend it, especially if it's a subject matter you're loosely familiar with, I highly recommend this book. Personally, I had to read it when the house was quiet. I took extensive notes. As you can see, I have extensive tabbing. There is an appendix that is nothing but the books mentioned in here, which is absolutely wonderful, especially since a lot of them are not, they are listed in chronological order. So if you want to read in chronological order, that is very helpful. I do need to sit down and figure out which of these I have read and which I am interested in, and how they, do I own them? How interested am I in them if I don't own them? The whole ranking thing. I will say I have read some of these. Some of these I have no interest in reading, like Elements of Geometry by Euclid. No, I don't need to read the medical writings of Hippocrates. Just not on my bailiwick. So, highly recommend. Thank you, Anne, for bringing this to my attention. And I have nothing but wonderful things to say about it. Okay, I have finished Homer. And the Odyssey is fantastic. And unlike the commentary floating around on social media, there is plenty of viewpoints and interaction and emphasis on the women in this story. They are not excluded, they are not marginalized, they are not just set dressing. Is it primarily a quote unquote male tale? Yes, of course it is. Odysseus is our main character. It would be kind of weird if the entire epic poem wasn't focused on the trials and tribulations of Odysseus returning home to his wife and child. That would be kind of odd. But then again, I'm a rational human being. So, there are plenty of references in the Odyssey about Helen of Troy being of fair skin, unlike, the movie trailers I've seen where Matt Damon, who is playing Odysseus, is old, gray, you know, aged. He's not that way in most of the book. In fact, he is turned old and aged by Athena when he lands back on Ithaca, and she removes the russet coloration from his hair so that he isn't immediately recognized upon reaching the shores of home. There's very little accuracy in the movie, and it is much. This translation, the Robert Fagles translation, is not only readable, it is viewpoint objective. It keeps the tenor of the epic poem. It doesn't insert modern day nonsense into some of our most ancient literature to twist reality. And I deeply appreciate that. And I didn't give a lot of comment. I haven't, broken in with a lot of commentary about the actual story that is, that is told in the Odyssey, because if you're going to pick it up and you read the preference, like in the Robert Fagles translation that I read, it talks a lot about what goes on in the story to begin with, but the poem itself tells its story beautifully. It doesn't need a lot of help along the way. Not once did I have to, seek an outside source to describe or translate or, figure out what was going on in the story. And it really is just Odysseus's adventure from the time he leaves Troy, and he's left Troy when, Odysseus makes his first scene on the page, and his struggle to get home to the wife he loves. And going in blind, I think, is the best way to approach that, because you get immersed in the story that is being told. Does he continue to incur Poseidon's wrath? Is he going to escape the Cyclops? Is he going to, be sucked in by the sirens? It's just this great, wonderful adventure story. It isn't complicated. It isn't a lot of names to remember. Are they difficult names to pronounce on occasion? Absolutely they are, because we don't have, Greek tripping off of our tongues on a regular basis, but it is still worth diving into. There are 24 books in this version, which I think is the most common version I've seen of, if not the only version I've seen of the Fagles translation. Each book is about 20 pages. You could easily, even if you just read one book a week, you'd finish this fairly quickly. And once the story gets going, you want to read more than one book a week. You want to see what happens next. But each book ends on a definitive ending. It isn't a cliffhanger. What happens in, book 7 concludes by the end of book 7, and book 8 is the next step on the journey. Books 1 through 3 is the setup, what's going on at home, Penelope and Telemachus fearing that he's dead, his father, the whole 9 yards. I cannot recommend this enough. As you know, Prime Day, I picked up the Iliad, which is also by Homer, and the Aeneid, which is by Virgil. Oh, they are both translated by Fagles. I'm going to read them both. I loved this in high school. I probably have said this already in this video, but I appreciate it much more as an adult because I now understand that longing to return home and, being willing to go through anything to get back. So it is a fantastic poem. Yes, it qualifies for Big Book Summer if you want to put it on for next summer, although I would recommend reading the Iliad first because the Iliad is first in the duology, if you want to call them a duology, because Odysseus is at Troy. That is why he left home in the beginning to begin with. And the only reason I read them out of order this time is because, well, that movie, that trash movie. No, I will not be seeing it. I won't even be hate watching it when it becomes free on every streaming service. So, highly recommend picking up Homer. Do not be afraid of it. If you are unsure which translation to get, yes, Emily Wilson's translations are highly popular at the moment. They are the basis for the movie. Do some research. I highly recommend Fagles. And you will be amazed at how easy it is to read and understand. And I know I spent much more time in this vlog on the preface, but the preface was amazing. I cannot recommend the preface of this book enough. And it's really the introduction. But so go pick up Homer. Go immerse yourself in ancient Greece. Go figure out, how much you're willing to do to return home to those you love. Let me know if you've read Homer or you're going to pick him up. Leave me a comment down below, like and subscribe, and I will see you here next time at the Protagonist Pub.